Back in 1996 or so, I gave at a symposium in Chicago a paper titled Continuations of Chan Ink Painting into Ming Qing and the Prevalence of Type Images. It aroused quite a stir with my colleagues who were there at the time, and they hailed it as a major contribution that would change everybody's way of thinking about later Chinese painting. And they were all asking about publishing this important paper. It was eventually published in the Archives of Asian Art number 50 for 1997 to 98, pages 17 to 41. And so far as I'm aware, it's been scarcely noticed since then. At least I haven't seen citations of it or heard responses to it. It's like the ending of that great Japanese movie Ikiru, Kurosawa film starring my favorite of his actors, Takashi Shimura, about the old guy who dies after committing one good act, and the people who gather to mourn his death and get drunk and all realize what he has done, and they all vow they're going to do the same and be good people. And then you see at the end, the next morning, they've all gone back to doing all the things they did before. Anyway, I want to present my paper in this new form. At first, I had the idea that I would just show the images I have for it, many of them missing, and wing it, that is, just talk freely with the commentary, just talking from memory. But when I reread the paper, I realized that, again, my old self, even 15 years ago, had more interesting ideas and formulations than I could produce now. So I'm going to stick fairly closely to the published paper while adding commentary as I go. And I encourage my serious listeners and scholars, especially scholars in the field, to search out the original article and read it with all the right illustrations assembled and reproduced there. But in this video lecture form, I will present the main points of my paper, expanding some of them as I go and showing many more images, as this medium encourages me to do, and abbreviating or eliminating others. So the published lecture and the video go together, each offering a lot that the other can't. First, please. Just to stand in for Chan painting while I talk, here are two notable examples seen in details. Liang Kai's paintings of the sixth Chan patriarch chopping bamboo, and another patriarch tearing up a sutra. I don't even want to raise the question, is there really such a thing as Chan painting, as others have done? I devoted several hours to it at the end of my first series. In my continuations article, I point out that we have it to look at only because of great examples preserved in Japan. Virtually no examples survive in China. And I raise this question: if Chan painting appears to come to an end in the Yuan dynasty, around the end of the Yuan dynasty, might that not be because the transportation of the paintings to Japan somehow ceased, so that it's as though post-Yuan Chan painting never existed? And the answer is obviously yes. It joins all the other kinds of Chinese painting that were not preserved in China because the powerful setters of taste there, the literati, the one run, persuaded everybody that it wasn't worth saving. But the production and appreciation of Chan painting and the preservation of genuine old examples might well have continued in places that we don't know about in China, notably the Chan temples and monasteries. And I point out that Chinese painting, as it was practiced all over China, was hugely larger than what surviving examples can testify to. Next. And I build a huge metaphor of Chinese painting as it was really produced over the centuries as a huge underground river, symbolized on screen by these images of fish, with the enormous quantity of paintings being done in China flowing along as time passes through the centuries. But for us, out of sight, except when a certain kind of painting is practiced by some artist who became famous, so that his works are preserved and we can see them. So that, in my metaphor, these stick up above the surface of the underground river and are visible. And we look at those and study them and pretend that they are the whole of Chinese painting and construct our histories around them and around other chance survivals. In China, Works that are preserved because they are provided with false seals and inscriptions and attributes are common, so they could be presented and sold as the works of prominent artists. Chinese collectors, as I pointed out many times, wanted only works with big names attached to them, so that even the finest works by minor masters or low-valued artists end up as fakes in the sense that they are misattributed or with some false indications of authorship to the great masters. Well, this is only a quick outline of my argument. Really, interested people should read my paper for the whole thing, but for now, we'll continue with my main narrative. So with that image in our minds of the underground river, with a few artisan paintings breaking the surface and becoming visible, let's proceed. Next. There are a few paintings of Chan Buddhist subjects by later Chinese artists that seem exceptions to that generalization. Here, for instance, is a painting of Budai or Hote, a typically a Chan's image in subject and style, done by the great late Ming master Zhang Hong. But this and a few others are exceptions, not enough to account for or demonstrate a continuous transmission, as my paper attempted to do. So we'll go to my paper now and see the images I used in it in succession. Next. In a big exhibition of unfamiliar Ming-Qing paintings shown at the Palace Museum in Beijing in December 1994, to coincide with the symposium that Xing Yuan and Rick Vinograd and I and others organized there for young specialists in Chinese painting, a very successful symposium from which the papers were, alas, never published. In that Google exhibition, a painting appeared that was a real surprise, a simple picture of the white-robed Guanyin by the woman artist Fang Wei-yi, done in 1655, when she was 70 years old. She was the aunt of Fang Yizhi and a distinguished poet and painter herself, specializing in pictures of the white-robed Guanyin. Standard accounts of her painting credit as her sources the great figure masters Wu Daozi and Li Gonglin. But those like myself who are familiar with Chan painting in Japan were immediately struck by the similarity with the works by the early Yuan monk artist, Jueji Yongzhong, several of whose works survive, two of them being white-robed Guanyin for their subjects. Next. So here they are together. And did this early Qing woman know the work of an obscure Yuan monk artist? Highly unlikely. What's more probable is that both were making use of an established image type that persisted across the centuries. And I go on to elaborate that conception of type images throughout my talk with numerous examples, images for which we cannot trace the creation usually, but we can watch it appear and reappear in the works of different artists across the centuries sometimes. And instead of falling back on the old pattern of one artist influencing another, or even the Baxendale correction of one artist adopting imagery from an earlier one, I propose that we see them all as drawing on the same established type image. This is a new concept that was recognized by the people at the symposium as one that could affect our studies of our subject. Now I'll have to revise my paper, said Ellen Lang and Rick Vinograd, as I remember, to accommodate this new conception. I suggest that the simplicity of the images and the way they are drawn in simple continuous line is because they were probably painted in large numbers each day as a kind of ritual act and given out to worshippers or admirers. In other words, that these two are chance survivors from hundreds or thousands of similar images, and I tell how the Bishop Kojo Sakamoto of the Kyoshi Kojin Temple, which I knew very well, I used to stay there, how he used to make images of the flaming jewel, symbol of his Shingon Buddhist sect, in huge numbers to give away to those who came to the temple. Next. And I went on to make the radical suggestion that many of the simple, spontaneously painted images that we admire today as inspired one-time creations of their artists, catching the momentary feeling of that moment, we usually say, that these might really be chance survivals of large-scale or multiple production. The example I gave was the simple picture of an orchid by the early Yuan master Zheng Zixiao, done as a political statement. I think many of you know that. He painted them without the earth around their roots, since the barbarian Mongols had stolen the Chinese earth. And I proposed that such simple paintings could have belonged to such a multiple production. And I pointed out something usually not noticed, that the cartouche with the date on this one is really applied with a stamp, or a seal, a stamp maybe, that leaves the month and the year open to be written in by brush. And this is a practice that's scarcely consistent with the standard notion of him dashing it off as a spontaneous, one-time expression. It indicates more multiple production. Next. Pausing for a moment to recall the origin of the white robe Guanyin image, at least its origin as traditionally traced, it was supposed to have been painted first by Li Gonglin, but innovations in art tend to be ascribed to recognized artists, while they may really be more obscure. Here's a detail from one of the late 12th century paintings in the Daitokuji in Kyoto, the 500 Arhat series, in which one Arhat shows a painting of this kind to others. Next. You will also remember, I hope, the great surviving painting of this subject, the centerpiece of Muqi's great triptych in the Daitokuji, this one taking the form of Guanyin meditating in a cave by the sea. Next. And quite a few examples by lesser artists, anonymous artists, survive in Japan, enough to testify to its original copious production. This anonymous Yuan example is drawn not in even line like Yongzhong's, but in brushstrokes that seem quickly applied and thicken and thin elegantly. A large exhibition could be made just of early paintings of the white-robed Guanyin, and those would be only a few of the hundreds or thousands that must have been painted. As I've said many times, we have the bad habit of building our histories of Chinese painting around the few examples that happen to have survived, instead of acknowledging the enormous output and the enormous losses by non-preservation or deliberate destruction that we know to be the truth of the matter. Next. Returning to Yongzhong of the Yuan period, here's another Guanyin by him, this one standing. The multiplicity of types within Guanyin paintings corresponds in part to the multiplicity of forms that this bodhisattva took. This is a subject studied notably by Yu Junfang of Rutgers University. Next. One of these types that's frequently represented in old paintings and that was popular especially on the southern coastal region of China is Guanyin with the fish basket, subject of a story that I won't relate here. This is an anonymous depiction of that subject. It has what appears to be a signature at the left, but cannot be deciphered. But it's probably that of another Yuan period monk artist. The painting appeared mysteriously in the Palace Museum in Beijing, of all places. It must have been brought to China by some Japanese and somehow made its way into the Palace Museum, because paintings of this kind, as I say, weren't preserved in China. The inscription at the top is by the famous monk Zhongfeng Mingban, about whom I talked at some length in my Sogengao lecture, showing several images of him. Next. Here's one of a number of portraits of Mingban that are preserved in Japan, brought back by monks who studied with him, and the paintings have been venerated in their temples or otherwise transmitted to Japan. Next. And here is another, this one, ink on paper, which must have been the low-price product in China. An old legend about how portraits of the Chan masters were presented to disciples when they achieved enlightenment and graduated, so to speak, from their studies. This old legend was eventually punctured. These paintings are in fact freely available for purchase in the monasteries. Next. This is another depiction of the fish basket Guanyin, this one by the well-known artist Guan Daosheng, who, besides being a noted literary woman and artist in her own right, was married to the famous artist-statesman Zhao Mengfu. The inscription in upper left is by the same Zhongfeng Mingbun, who must have spent much of every day inscribing paintings for people. The inscription in upper right is by Zhao Mengfu, and the more modest one in lower right is by Guan Daosheng herself. Typical of how these people presented themselves. The image that she paints, perhaps one she did in multiples as a devotional act, conforms fairly closely to a well-known type of religious figure of that time. Well-known are examples by an artist named Yin To Lo. The shaky, broken-line drawing of her garment conveys her guise of an impoverished fish seller in the market, a guise that this form of Guanyin used to lure men to Buddhist enlightenment. Next. Guan Daosheng is best known not for figure paintings, but for pictures of bamboo. And she painted it not close-up in the calligraphic manner used by male literati artists from Wentong onward, but instead following a local tradition in Zhejiang for painting it growing in clumps in an atmospheric setting. This is another of these small artist traditions so scorned by Chinese collectors that no examples were preserved there. But quite a few fine examples were brought to Japan and are preserved there. Many of them with seals of or attributions to a mysterious artist named Tanzhi Rui, one of those masters the Chinese didn't recognize as important enough to record, whose works are preserved only in Japan. A few of them bearing seals with his name, Tanzhi Rui. These small paintings are, for me as a group, more interesting than the flat, brushworky kinds of bamboo paintings that belong to the Chinese literati tradition and were done by the hundreds of thousands and millions, probably, by everybody who could pick up a brush, pretty much. Next. A painting of groves of bamboo growing by a stream by Guan Daosheng appeared in the Chinese Art Treasures exhibition of 1970, was it, as one item in a collective hand scroll containing works by 8 Yuan period artists. I don't have good images of it now, and I put in this poor image of the whole to represent it and to call it to your attention. Next, please. A finer painting by Guan Daosheng, an ink-on-paper picture depicting tall bamboo growing by a stone. I'm not sure where this one is, perhaps the Shanghai Museum. Her paintings of this kind show her as participating, as I say, in a regional style. She lived in that region, Zhejiang, I believe, and she didn't work in, as I say, and belong to the male literati movement. Well, good for her. Next. I showed some of these small paintings, loosely ascribed to Tanzhi Rui, in my lecture on the Hikoen album. The album contains one of them. Together, these paintings make up a visually engaging group of modest works that continue the late Song tradition of presenting natural materials in atmospheric settings with misty space around them, and sometimes wind blowing them, or in the Freer example, snow on them and snow on the ground. They continue, that is, that tradition of representing the real world with an artist's eye and the artist's understanding, and an artist's representational technique, a tradition declared by the male elite literati to be so unworthy of refined appreciation or collection, as they loftily put it, that examples haven't survived in China. And they oblige us, yet once more, to recognize the enormous losses that we would have suffered if we knew Chinese painting only from what has been preserved in China. And the most important body of painting of which that can be said is, of course, to state it yet again, Chan Buddhist painting. Next. Here's a series of Chan Buddhist images. I'm putting them on just to show this quality of what the certain Chinese connoisseurs call bad brushwork, but which had to be used by the Chan artists to achieve their purposes. Here, for the first, is the great Muqi gibbon and mother, seeing the gibbon and mother far out on the limb. Oh, a great, great painting. This is one of the triptych in the Daitokuji, as I say. And if you look at the detail up close, next please, here is the detail of just the tree. And you see exactly why C.C. Wang, when I looked at this with him, used to say, "Oh, Jim, you can see this isn't really good painting. Look at the brushwork, it's terrible." And indeed, from C.C. Wong's perspective, it was undisciplined and terrible. But using the literati disciplines would have ruined the purpose, spoiled the whole purpose. It would have made the picture into a proper literati painting, and it would be stiff and conventional and all the things that it isn't. Whereas this has this amazing naturalism and immediacy that pull us to it. Okay, next. Here is another painting attributed to Mucci of Genzo, the shrimp catcher, catching a shrimp, holding it up, and sort of smiling with glee that he has caught this shrimp. And here, next, up close, the detail, the face and the shrimp and the hand are fairly clearly drawn, but look at that messy brushwork for his robe and his sleeve. Boy, no literati painter would have tolerated that. And yet this is up there among the almost national treasure level in Japan, and it properly should be. As I say, the Chan Buddhists had to ignore all these dictates of this is the way we have to use the brush or else nobody's going to look at it, of the scholar artists, because this is a different bunch of people, really. Next, and here's a painting of a meeting by moonlight, somebody on a buffalo, a boy on a buffalo meeting a Chinese scholar who leans over, and extraordinary slope with trees, paintings that used to be owned by, well, never mind, a dealer, a friend of ours. I don't know where it is now. It went through auction anyway. Fine painting. Small painting on silk. He added a date on it, as I remember. Okay, then, now going back to my lecture and so on. I showed in my talk, but I didn't reproduce in the published article, several paintings of long-stemmed vegetables as examples of yet another type, about which Elfriede Merck, had just published an article pointing out that these paintings carried a political message, derived in large part from two poems by Du Fu. I give a reference to her article in my paper. The article was published in Archives of Asian Art, number 48 for 1995. Okay, next please. Returning to the earlier theme, here is one of the Guanyin with a fish basket pictures. This one painted by the Ming artist Xu Wei. It's quite similar to the ones we saw by Guan Daosheng and the anonymous Yuan artist. And once more, does this mean that Xu Wei saw these paintings? Highly unlikely. He's only taking up and using this version of what had developed into a type image. I was trying to drive this concept into the minds of the audience at my lecture, and I think I did. But as I say, has any of them really used it since then? If they have, it's without my knowledge. But I think it's really important to the study of Chinese painting and how we understand the repetition of images. So I keep on producing examples. Next, please. I asked rhetorically, can this be true of landscapes too? Surely they can't not be turned into types. One's first response is likely to be, no, they are too varied and multifarious, too full of distinguishing details. They're not like simple images of vegetables and the like. But is that really true? And I turn to the recently published group of excavated paintings found in one of two scrolls in the sleeves of a person buried at a place called Huai'an in southern Zhejiang province. Next. The paintings in that scroll were all done for a minor official named Zheng Sun. That is one of the two scrolls. She's not the person buried, but they were done for him. Zheng Jun, who was active in the late 15th century. And he appears to have traveled to the capital in Beijing, perhaps Nanjing, I'm not clear, and he visited some of the prominent court artists of that time. And probably in turn for some kind of gift, they each painted a small conventional picture for him. 3 of these paintings are hills and clouds pictures, like the one seen here. This one was done by one such artist, Xie Huan. Next. I and my students in our work on political themes in Chinese paintings had discovered that paintings of this subject could carry, when presented to a scholar official, the auspicious message that the people he was going to govern were awaiting his coming like the farmers welcoming the nourishing rain that brought them good crops. And the inscription on this one corroborates that meaning, carrying very much the same message. Next. Another of these three, this one by Li Zai, an even more prominent Just School artist. We knew him already by quite a few landscapes, including a famous one in the Tokyo National Museum, which I'll show later. Now here he was doing this simple and sketchy picture of a kind that cannot have taken him more than a few minutes. Chinese specialists greeted the discovery of these paintings by saying and writing, "Now we see that these Academy artists, whom we knew before only from their big, impressive hanging scrolls on silk, could also do these quick and simple sketches. They are practicing the self-expressive kind of xue." Next. So I had to write in my recently published, 20 years later published actually, article titled "Xue in the Just School, ? Some Thoughts on the Huayan Tomb Paintings." I had to write in this a contrary message, which can be summed up as, you guys are misinterpreting those paintings. They are not simple and sketchy because the artists are being self-expressive, but because they are doing quick pictures for some minor occasion and patron. Pictures that the Chinese haven't on the whole considered worth preserving, so that we mostly don't know about them. But when examples are preserved by chance, through burial or some other circumstance, we find out about them, and we learn more about the range of products that these professional artists were turning out to suit the occasion and to suit their various types of patrons and so on. My article appears, by the way, in the latest issue of Archives of Asian Art, with prefatory notes by Jerome Silbergelt and myself about why it was delayed and why it's still worth publishing. Next. And here is still another, by still another artist of the time, He Cheng. They begin to be boring? Of course they do, but they were never meant to be seen together in this way. Next. They were not, as I say, even meant to be preserved, and are preserved only by chance. And they tell us a lot about the real nature of Chinese painting as it was produced, in quantities vastly beyond anything that we've imagined, making up the great imaginary underground river of my metaphor. Next. Another kind of chance transmission, not intended by the artist, is preservation in Japan. Here are two farewell paintings of the kind that Chinese artists painted for people who were leaving the capital to return to wherever, and a painting of this kind would be presented to them to take with them. And these two, and others of the kind, happen to have been done for Japanese Buddhists who received them when they went back to Japan. And the paintings they brought back were preserved as treasures in their temples, in their Japanese temples. These two were done by the well-known Academy and Just School masters Daijin and Wu Wei. I can't remember who did which, and it doesn't really matter. I took these, as I remember, from an article by Mieko Murase on farewell paintings, which was published in Artibus Asiae for 1970. Next. One might object to this rather dismissive account of the repetitive and routine production of paintings in China and say, all right, that may be true of these minor works that the artist dashed off, but when they do large, serious works, they are more inventive and original. To which I would reply, yes, but those too are likely to follow formulae in their subjects and styles, however original they may look at first glance. Here are two hanging scrolls by Li Zai, large paintings on silk, impressive compositions with lots of interlocked spaces and fine detail. But when we begin comparing them more closely, we see that they both seem to follow a formula. Now in each of them you see they are both dwelling in seclusion pictures in which the scholar, presumably some lofty scholar who has served in the administration and is now escaping into the countryside, retiring or spending the summer, is seen in a waterside pavilion here. His houses behind, now this is only part of his villa, in the foreground. And then further back are little thatched houses, dwelling close to people. Country people is always part of the ideal. And you see people on the path making their way into the picture behind. And then up above in the upper right is a Buddhist temple. And in the other one, here it's still another one, exactly the same thing. scholar in his waterside pavilion, fishermen down below, communing with the ordinary people then, and further back the usual thatched houses, and then up in the upper right, a Buddhist temple. This kind of composition, of course, goes back eventually to the great gouache painting, as many of you will immediately recognize. Okay, next. Now, returning to my metaphorical image of Chinese painting as it was produced in unimaginable quantities as a vast underground river flowing through the centuries, a chance find of kinds that were not usually preserved, such as the Huayan tomb find I've just talked about, offers a kind of window into the depths through which we can see kinds of paintings that were not otherwise visible. What other windows do we have that would allow us to view the assumed continuation of Chan painting in Chan monasteries and elsewhere? We do have one such window, an important one. The preserved body of paintings done by monk artists of the Huangbo, Japanese Obaku sect, which was along the southern coast of China in Fujian province. And some of the monks from the Obaku or Huangbo sect moved to Japan in the 17th century and went on painting there. So Obaku painting in Japan, which has been preserved in Obaku temples there and studied as a group, my article gives references to studies of it, can serve to reveal the kind of painting done by Huangbo monks in China in the 17th century. I reproduced a few examples. A painting of Bodhidharma crossing the river on a reed, seen here by Tsai Jen, Japanese Saikon, one of these monks. It looks very much like paintings of the same subject done by Chan artists of the Sungyuan period. In other words, we have here another very close continuation of an image, or a type image. Okay, next. And here is another, a painting of Budai, or Hote, by Inen, or Ichunen, another of the prominent figures among these monks. And again, it's scarcely to be distinguished from a Sungyuan painting of the same subject. The practice among Chan monks of producing this kind of paintings in large numbers clearly continued from the Yuan period on, and one can only imagine how many were painted every year in the whole of China, and then imagine how many in the whole Ming dynasty. It staggers the imagination just to think of the paper they consumed, and ink and brushes, wow. Next, still another painting I used, a painting of Lan Hua, the Chinese orchid growing by rocks. This one by Bo Ziting, another Chan monk artist of the Yuan period, which has been preserved. At least 4 of his works are preserved in Japan. And a similar painting in hanging scroll form, inscribed at the top, by another Obaku artist, Ji Fei or Tsokuhi, done, of course, in the late Ming. I could have continued with more such pairings, but these alone provide abundantly clear evidence for the transmission of Chan painting into the Ming-Qing period, answering the question raised in my title. Was it continued? Yes, it was. So, having made that point firmly, I went on to imagine that we had another window through which we could gaze down at the practice of Chan painting by artists of that sect, working in the region of Nanchang in Jiangxi province in the late Ming and early Qing. If we had that window, we would be able to observe the tradition that Bada Shanran continues, fairly closely in his early paintings, with a greater departure in the later ones, because it's Bada Shanran to whom this whole lecture is really leading up, as you will see. Next. I use the example of Bada Shanran to make an important point, that simply reusing the type images that they inherit is the practice of most would-be artists who painted in China. And because they didn't contribute anything significantly new, they are forgotten today. I referred to them as failed Bada Shanrans. Jonathan Hay later spoke up, objecting to the term. I can't remember his defense of them, but he often finds reason to differ from my assertions and arguments, which of course is okay. It's just what he should do. Another way, that is, for artists to, quote, break the surface of my underground river is to be original and interesting artists, and then they become visible, so to speak. Their works are preserved. Next, please. So then I set off on another part of my elaborate argument with its visuals, showing how various images that one finds in the Muqi copy scroll, seen here in its entirety, are taken up by these later artists and repeated and adapted and transformed in various ways, serving in this way as what I call type images. And I used for my purpose one of the two scrolls of paintings of vegetables and other things by Muqi, which I've talked about in several of my lectures. As some of you will remember, two hand scrolls by Muqi made up of pictures of these subjects, the kind he was criticized during his lifetime for painting, were copied sometime around the late Yuan or early Ming. And those two copies, or at least one of them, seems to have been known to Ming artists such as Shenzhou, Chunshun, and Chu Wei, who used images from it in their own paintings. That it was one of these copy scrolls that they saw, we know from seals and colophons on it. The other one in the Palace Museum in Beijing hasn't been properly published and studied. This is a great thesis topic for anyone hearing this lecture. Dig out that other scroll and type in Beijing and reproduce it and write about it. Next. And here are two sections of an early scroll of the same kind by Bada Shanran, done when he was still using the Chuan Qi signature, as it's seen on the early album in the Taipei Palace Museum. I cannot emphasize enough that this elaborate metaphor of mine of the underground river and of paintings that for some reason break the surface and come to our attention, and the even more elaborate arguments behind it, represent a fundamentally new way of seeing and thinking about the whole tradition of Chinese painting, and one that I firmly believe is more true to the realities of it than the ones that we've been operating with, whether Chinese or foreign. And I believe that understanding it and adopting it would transform for the better the study of Chinese painting. This is why I put it forth with such force and detail in the first place, enough to persuade those who heard it, and why I want now to call it to the attention of more scholars and students in the field. Don't just watch this video. Go back and read my article and ponder it and respond to it and use it. This is a big part of the legacy of James Cahill to the field of Chinese painting. Next. Now I'll go on to show a few examples of this kind of subsurface transmission and occasional surface breaking using works by Shenzhou, Chunshun, or Chandalfu, Xu Wei, and Bada Shanran chiefly, with a few Obaku paintings also. Next. The familiar painting of grapes on the vine by the late Song Chuan artist Guan. He uses the ink monochrome medium brilliantly to capture the roundness of the grapes, to depict the layers of leaves overlaying one another, and so forth. This highly representational use of the medium, the ink monochrome medium, pretty much ends with a Sung. Yuan and later artists, even the best of them, use it for different purposes. Next. Shenzhou, among those who derive imagery from Sung examples and copies of them, is the one who copies them most closely. His originality is manifested rather in his landscape paintings. Here is his image of grapes, in which he tries to copy but misunderstands the device of leaving some leaves in reserve, set white against the black ink leaves, black and gray ink leaves. Next. The cabbage of the two vegetable paintings attributed to Muqi in the Goto Art Museum in Tokyo. The Chuan artist, Muqi or whoever, ignores criteria of good brushwork to endow his image with real three-dimensionality, the light leaf in front coming forward convincingly, another going back. This was part of the sheer pictorial mastery of these late Song artists, who were concerned with the integrity of the image and its function of calling up the real thing as if it were before your eyes. Nothing could be further from the intent of the typical Yuan and later artists. Next. Shenzhou, in his image of the same, flattens it. Even the leaves that seem to turn in space end up staying on the same plane, not really receding or coming forward. His inscriptions are replete with literary allusions and learned citations, and done in good calligraphy. He is catering to a whole different world of people, the cultivated scholar artists. Of course, he is one of them. Next. The turnip from the Goto Museum pair, again presumably by Muqi, is still another fine example of the late Sung Chan master's informal representational employment of the ink monochrome medium, healthily devoid of brush discipline and strict control of tonality and all that. The images of vegetables from the Mu-Chi copy scroll, by contrast, lie flat on the surface, and the eye sweeps over them without impediment, playing to the new viewer's recognition of the way it preserves some qualities of the original images that would not violate those new viewers' tastes and preferences, as the original Mu-Chi images would have violated them. Next. The leaves of the turnips are done in differing depths of ink tone, but not in such a way as to make some of them recede, others come forward, or to render visually their overlapping and their separation in depth. Next. Shunzhou's turnips, he inscribes the date, the second year of Hongzhi, which corresponds to 1489. How well his new style fit the tastes of the dominant connoisseurs and critics of the Ming-Qing period is indicated by the imperial and other prestigious seals on it. All of these comparisons illustrate over and over my facetious image offered late in my paper for the Shanghai Museum exhibition on early Chinese paintings from Japanese collections. My image of how Mu-Chi was able to enter the palace like a hero of a Western fairy tale, but only after being emasculated, his paintings robbed of their potency. An image not free from the tinge of the vulgar, but embodying a large truth that I want to impress as strongly as I can on all students of Chan painting and its aftermath. Next. When an artist like Bada Shanran raises such a type image again to the level of interesting or even great art, as indeed he does, it's not by restoring the three-dimensionality and naturalism to it, but by using it for new departures into styles that we might call expressionistic, even quasi-cubist. I spent some time with this album leaf of vegetables by him in my lecture on him. It's always been one of my favorites. He manages to give some volume and readable surface to the large root vegetable at right, with broken brush strokes that also bend upwards at the ends to make this mass readable as surface and volume, a remarkable feat in itself. But no one would mistake this for a return to a late Sung-like use of ink monochrome for trenchantly real-looking images. That was not going to be achieved again in Chinese painting. Next. Another example of Bada's brilliant transforming of more conventional brush images can be shown by the pairing of two images, both horizontal album leaves. This one, depicting two crabs, is by the Obaku artist Da Peng, or Tai Ho. It's an interesting painting with some suggestions that one of the crabs is approaching and menacing the other. Next. And here is a painting of two crabs by Bada Shanran from the same album as the remarkable painting of vegetables that I just showed. He has locked the two crabs together in combat. Pairings of this kind, and we art historians should make them frequently in our writings and our lectures, serve to bring out important distinctions between styles and their readings, and to illustrate how good or great painting differs from good but commonplace painting. If we don't constantly offer such pairings and such judgments and explain why we are qualified to make them through our visual training, we aren't doing our job properly or completely. Next. The comparisons that I used toward the end of my paper for the Shanghai Museum exhibition of early Chinese paintings from Japan used this image of a flower, perhaps a hyacinth, I don't know. One of the real Mu-Chi images, presumably originally mounted as part of such a hand scroll, but cut up in Japan so that the individual images could be mounted as small hanging scrolls and viewed in tokonoma alcoves. The Japanese, although they use the hand scroll form for their emaki or narrative paintings, they don't have much use for the Chinese kind of hand scroll made up of image after image. And these pictures of low subjects, as they were called by Mu-Chi, in the originals, repay long contemplation as Chan paintings in the highest sense, as I have tried to define it. For instance, in my very long video lecture on the famous 6 persimmons, this flower offers all the violations of good brushwork that got Mucci ostracized from the ranks of acceptable artists, or for the sympathetic eye, raises him to the ranks of great masters. And I've described these many times, and I needn't do so again, I think. They're all there for you to see as I talk. Next. Neatened, flattened, robbed of its vitality in the copy, it became fit for Chinese connoisseurs to appreciate, and so they did, as the seals of Xiang Yuanbian and others testify, and the imperial seals, which complete my fairy tale entry of the scroll into the palace collection. Next. The 17th century master Chun Shun, or Chun Daofu, is another who participates in this series as I've constructed it, doing near copies of some of the images in the Mucci copy scroll. This is the flower by him that I reproduced in my article, commenting that it is wetter, freer, more painterly than Shunzhou's, and encourages a closer visual engagement with the flower. Next. In this, Chun Shun was succeeded and exceeded, I wrote, by Xu Wei, who recaptured in his own way the wildness and vitality of the Daitokuji picture. I point out in my article, and what I wrote there is only a short note on a matter that I and my students at that time worked hard to establish, I point out that Xu Wei, like Shunzhou, frequented Chan and other Buddhist monasteries, sometimes stopping in them while traveling, so that he would have had ample opportunities to view paintings that they treasured. I was trying to give a basis for the physical transmission of these paintings, but also for the ways in which the artists who imitate them can have seen them. This is a matter deserving of more research, as it is a needed underpinning for my argument, and even this very brief summary of it has helped to keep you gazing at this remarkable image from the great Xu Wei scroll in the Nanjing Museum. I remember so well when we made it on our 1977 delegation trip to China, and I made these images. I'll have a video lecture on Xu Wei in which I show all the images I have, supposing that my visual and other faculties last long enough for me to make it. Next. A flower painted by Shinyue, or Shin Etsu, one of the Obaku artists, loses all this force and becomes flat and inert. Again, a good illustration of what distinguishes good or great from mediocre or bad painters. Next. Finally, for this series of plant and fruit subjects, a pair of pomegranates, one of them bursting open, which we see in both the Mucci copy scroll and in one of the early Bada Shanran scrolls. The pomegranate was an auspicious image, standing for the Chinese family ideal of many children, mostly sons. It's the image near the right in the Mucci copy scroll and at the top center of the Bada scroll. Next. Shunzhou depicts it with his usual strengths of brushwork and strong design and weakness of imagery, turning it into another scholar-artist exercise. His verse at the top presumably offers learned literary allusions that mostly escape me. Next. Chun Shun, or Chun Daofu, again recaptures some of the variety of brushwork and forms that made the original so compelling, and adds his own learned inscription in good calligraphy. Next. But once more it is Xu Wei, among the Ming masters, and especially in his great Nanjing Museum hand scroll, who, as I wrote in my article, depicts it with that dazzling reconciliation of calligraphic freedom and trenchant description in which he is unsurpassed, end quote. A detail of it, revealing even more strikingly the brilliance of this master. Who else could, within a whole effect of total spontaneity and freedom, offer such a rich range of ink tonality and brushstroke types? We need to keep redefining the qualities that define greatness in painting, and we need to do it by pushing close-up images like this into the faces of our listener viewers and keeping them there for a long time until their eyes have been able to absorb the powerful, non-repetitive, controlled spontaneity of the brushstrokes. I've tried to do that at moments like this one in my own video lectures, and I feel that doing it has been a big part of my legacy for future generations and for what I hope will be a strong future for visual art history of Chinese painting. And if someone in the future asks, why did he talk so long, others of you will be able to give the right answer to keep you looking. Next. From the sublime to the near ridiculous, or at least very weak and minor. This is the pomegranates on their vine, as painted by one of the Obaku artists, Bo Yen. I won't leave it on for long because there isn't much to see. Next. The same subject, rendered in a color woodblock print, a double page from the Shijujai Shuhopu, the great collection of pictorial woodblocks after paintings produced around the end of the Ming period. Doing the pictures in rich color and with strong effects of realism, which would have signified a lower class ranking in brush painting, but which was being practiced all the time by professional and other artists who didn't adhere to the literary dogmas, these were tolerable in woodblock pictures. I'm doing a whole long lecture on pictorial printing in China, which will address all these issues. Next. Finally, in my article, I went back to the Mu-Chi copy scroll, this time looking at the end, where two myna birds are seen on a hillock of earth beside some grasses. Even in the copy, I commented, the birds retain something of the slightly malevolent look that mynas really have when one observes them, as I remember doing for one in China, a bird in a cage. They look as if they were endowed with human-like feelings. They strike poses and they cock their heads expressively. Next. Even that much of a darker meaning is lost in the copy by Shunzhou, whose birds seem simple-minded, less self-aware. Shunzhou keeps the basic pattern of the pairing with one bird in strict profile and the other turning its head back. This latter bird seems somewhat off balance, but not as Bada Shanran's birds in a way that reads as deliberate effect. Next. Bada Shanran, in his hand scroll from the early 1690s, keeps the basic pattern of Mu-Chi's painting even more closely than does Shunzhou. But in addition to catching more of the slightly sinister overtones of Mu-Chi's birds, Bada introduces quirky devices of his own that transform the image into an item of his own private imagery. The disapproving gaze or glare of the birds is now concentrated on a seemingly innocent lotus plant. The bird looking backward is now decidedly and deliberately off balance, and a smaller bird perches incongruously on the back of the other. No pairing could better illustrate the distinction I would like to make between simply adopting the inherited image as a convenience for producing a painting quickly and using it as a jumping-off point for truly creative ventures. Next. How much further Bada Shanran jumped in his transformations of motifs of this kind, we all know. His pictures of paired myna birds and other birds alone would make up a small exhibition, and a thoroughly engaging one. And we could similarly show how he transformed other motifs and type images that he inherited from the Chan ink painting tradition, beginning with Sungyuan examples and ending with his brilliant manipulations of them. Melons, fish, geese, cranes, lotuses, and others. I don't mean that the Chan painting tradition was his only source, but it was an important one, and one that is currently mostly overlooked. Next. A few more of his paintings with paired birds to end with. Recognizing and acknowledging Bada's heritage from Chan painting and the ways he used it will at least rescue us from the type of naive accounts in which such paintings came into being because Bada lived near a hill on which such birds congregated in pairs, and he went out every day to observe them, and he felt a powerful urge to capture their images and behavior with his brush, and so forth. Bada must indeed have studied the habits of myna birds, and he certainly was adept at capturing their characteristic poses and movements. But all that, I believe, came after, belonging to a Gombrich-like phase, in which the inherited schemata are adapted to make them conform better to the artist's observation of nature, as well as to his expressive purpose and his state of mind. And it is those transformations and the succession of brilliant works based on them that in the end matter most. We only demean the truly creative masters when we fail to distinguish their best achievements from the more or less routine uses of type images by artists of less originality and attainment, or by the masters themselves under certain circumstances. So ends, and I've read it completely, the long last paragraph of my article, which states, with a clarity that I could not achieve now, a profound belief about Chinese painting and all painting that I believe to be one of my major contributions to the field of art history. And since I cannot top that as a statement of self-praise, I had best end at last this long lecture, composed and typed out with failing eyesight but undiminished enthusiasm in mid-March 2013 by James Cahill.